This podcast is not a source of legal advice. No two legal cases are the same. Contact an attorney if you require legal assistance. Welcome to the NJ Criminal Podcast.
Welcome back to New Jersey Criminal Podcast. On April 13th, 2022, Acting Attorney General for the state of New Jersey, Matthew Platkin, sent a memo to police chiefs across the state advising them that an officer's off-duty possession or use of cannabis should not result in any discipline against the officer. Here with us to discuss cannabis consumption by law enforcement is Middle Township Chief of Police, Chris Leusner. Chief, welcome.
Thanks, Meg.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for taking the time and how busy you are. I want to just jump right in and talk about the memo that came out on April 13th, 2022. And you've spoken about it in the past, which is why I asked you to join us here for this season of NJ Criminal Podcast when we're discussing all things related to cannabis. What do you think precipitated Acting Attorney General Platkin to send out the memo in April?
Sure. My understanding was that the state was going to start opening up the first dispensaries for recreational use, that the Cannabis Regulatory Commission was going to issue licenses, and that some facilities that were medical marijuana were going to be able to switch pretty quickly to sell recreationally. So with that step, you were going to have for the first time regulated cannabis, or be able to purchase regulated cannabis in the state as a recreational user without a medical marijuana card. So it's my understanding that's what prompted the Attorney General to send out a memo communicating to us what the law was, in his view, that you cannot take any adverse action against an employee for cannabis use while not working. And that's what it was. He's expressed, I believe, publicly that he has concerns, but he has to follow the law, and that his opinion, there's no carve out for law enforcement.
Right, and I think that memo indicates that it is an interpretation of the law, not a ruling or decision, and still notes that there would be zero tolerance for cannabis use, possession or intoxication while performing duties of a law enforcement officer. Why did you choose to, publicly speak out against this memo? What are some of the issues that you see in permitting sworn law enforcement officers in the state of New Jersey to use cannabis, whether on duty or off duty?
Well, look, I have issues with the legislation. I think the legislature should act and make it clear that police officers should not be able to consume cannabis off duty at all. So I have concerns. I've expressed those concerns publicly, but some reasons for that. Cannabis stays in your system for up to 28 days, right? Mm-hmm. Being able to say that someone was under the influence at a specific date and time is something that is a challenge. And there's not scientific agreement or consensus in the scientific community as to, what level of, cannabis is in your system or your blood is a per se violation like we have with alcohol. So one of the examples I talk about is when I was president of the State Chiefs Association, I traveled to Toronto with our executive director, and we were there to learn how they managed legalizing cannabis across the country. And we were in the Toronto Police Department headquarters, and the commissioner spoke with us about his policy, where he said that police officers could not consume cannabis 28 days prior, because that's how long it can take to be out of your system. And he did not want to be in a position where if an officer involved shooting, an officer involved accident, and there was blood evidence and showed cannabis in the system, and then they were in a position to argue, well, that was from 10 days ago. He or she was not under the influence at the time of the shooting or the accident. Now, of course, the fire siren goes off while we're in the middle of.
It always does. I remember I worked down in Cape May Courthouse for a long time, and right around this time, it always went off. So that's good. We know you're at work, Chief.
Yep. So, that particular concern is one that I share. Now, right next door, the Peel Police Service, the commissioner there, who had a significant police force, his position was he was going to treat it just like alcohol, that you had a responsibility to show up for work and not under the influence of any, substance, whether it be alcohol and or cannabis. And if they saw signs that someone was intoxicated, that they were going to take action and document their observations and go through the disciplinary process. So, just in Canada, right next to each other, two departments have bordered one another, two, different approaches. I share the concerns of the commissioner from Toronto. I don't want to be in that position where we have to argue, especially now with the scrutiny of law enforcement in use of force situations and just about everything that we do, that we're trying to articulate, we have an officer that used cannabis, but he or she wasn't under the influence at the time. So that's one of my main concerns.
Right, and I can see that there would be certainly a concern with regard to civil liability, and particularly a related topic is the issue of not related to police officers, but individuals who have consumed marijuana and then are involved in either an accident where they're believed to be under the influence, or just charged with driving while impaired. And so, just as a side note, I'm hopefully going to be interviewing an expert pharmacologist, toxicologist on the issue of how marijuana is metabolized in the system. And do you think it's a testing issue? Do you think that if one were able to quantify the active metabolite in an officer's system, or do you still think that there would be the potential, for civil liability either way?
Look, my understanding from, speaking with, different folks in this field, there is not consensus in the scientific community yet. Mm-hmm. I'm told that cannabis can affect everyone differently. That one person may consume cannabis and be impacted for a longer period of time, and someone who maybe has a tolerance can ingest cannabis and process it sooner. Mm-hmm. That it's not necessarily what's in the bloodstream, but other parts of the body of how it impacts, and that's my understanding, and I think that's why you have not seen a device. And I know there's a race in the scientific community to try to develop some type of breathalyzer or some type of machine to be able to say, this is a per se violation. In Canada, they had a machine, and they picked a number, but they acknowledged that, there was not agreement amongst the scientific community that per se violation actually meant that they were intoxicated at the time.
Right, and there's always challenges to the scientific reliability of things. Look at the ALCA test.
Yep.
So aside or secondary to the civil liability is a question that I had regarding gun permits. Correct me if I'm wrong, but federal laws prohibit marijuana users from owning a gun. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. And so how
federal law does.
Federal law, right. And so I'm not familiar, maybe you can just quickly explain it, with regard to sworn law enforcement officers and what they have to go to have a gun and what they have to certify. Does that put a law enforcement officer who is, perhaps considering using cannabis off duty in a precarious situation with regard to their gun permit?
Well, so we don't issue a permit to a police officer that's hired, mm-hmm. right? We hire a 21-year-old officer. We don't go through a process where they obtain a gun permit. We do a background investigation, psychological, medical examination. They graduate the police academy. We provide the firearm. There's no permit in that particular process. So under the federal law, according to the Attorney General, that a law enforcement agency is exempt from that federal statute that says that a drug user cannot possess a firearm. So in terms of a police department providing a firearm to an officer, I don't think there's a conflict with the federal law, or at least that's what the Attorney General tells us. Now, I have legal counsel, also labor counsel, specifically for the police department, which I run these issues through. And when the Attorney General puts out a policy that he interprets something a certain way, we always, consult with our labor counsel, and I encourage people to do that. So from a police perspective, I don't believe there's a conflict. Where I think there is a conflict, and the Attorney General has said this publicly, that there is a conflict in the law, is what do you do when a resident puts down on a form that they use cannabis? It's legal in the state, but illegal federally. What happens then with approving that firearm permit by the chief? And if the chief denied it, what's the Superior Court judge going to do in that case when there's a clear conflict between state and federal law?
Okay, I see.
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, I see. Thank you for clarifying that for me. But that is an issue for anyone who would be applying, a citizen, private citizen, who would be applying for a gun permit and consuming cannabis and putting that on their application, correct?
It would be, yeah. I haven't had any applications where someone has put that down yet. And if that happened, I would go to the Calumet County Prosecutor's Office and ask for a legal opinion as to how I would handle that. But it is a clear conflict. And, the Attorney General, he testified in front of the legislature, and he acknowledged that there is a clear conflict with federal law and state law related to those issues.
Do you know whether any local police departments require their officers to purchase their own guns?
I am not aware of that. We purchase the weapons.
Okay, got it.
I believe most departments do, is my experience.
Got it, okay. And you touched upon this a little bit already. Certainly the argument would be, I imagine, that, well, it's just like alcohol. A police officer after work can go and have a beer. Why is this different? I think you touched upon it already with regard to the length of time that it stays in the system. And you also mentioned, and I should have put this in my introduction. You are the immediate past president of the State Police Chiefs Association.
Well, past president. We just had a new president sworn in June. But I'm a past president. I was immediate president.
Got it. Okay.
About a month ago.
And so, are you, I'm not going to ask you to quote anybody, but are you sensing that this is a concern among many of the police chiefs in the state?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. All the police chiefs are concerned. For the reasons I said, I also feel like from a public trust perspective, that the public knows that there are certain employees, sensitive employees that are out there in the community, such as police officers who have, the authority to use deadly force, this shouldn't even be a question in my view. And the law should be clear that police officers, in my opinion, should be exempt from this law and not use cannabis off duty. So, it's a civil liability issue, certainly, but it's also, a concern, in my view, from a public trust standpoint. And then there's other issues. One of the things we talked about, if you're a police officer that is, looking to rise through the ranks and eventually go to the FBI National Academy someday, federal law still applies. You go through a separate background investigation. I went to the FBI National Academy. If an officer decides to say, okay, I'm going to use cannabis off duty, there's other things that may impact, their career down the line if this law doesn't change, such as that, or being on a federal task force. I was just going to
say that. There's oftentimes when local officers are assigned temporarily to federal task force, that would certainly create a problem.
Yep.
My intern this summer is a college student, and she is in the ROTC, and she has indicated that they've been advised they can't consume cannabis, and again, it's because it is still against the law, against federal law. And so it's the same concept. What do you think the next steps are? Is there a mechanism for local chiefs and departments to challenge this, or what do you think? Is it just a matter of cautioning your officers? Or what do you think the next steps are?
Well, I do know that the legislature is aware of this issue. The State Chiefs Association has engaged with a number of legislators on this issue. It appears to have bipartisan support. However, the Senate President Nick Scutari was one of the original authors of the legalization of marijuana bill. So he's an important player in legislation, and I don't think he shares the same concerns that I outlined earlier about carving out an exempt for law enforcement. So, I think this is something that, to resolve this, would be a legislative fix. I don't know if a challenge in the courts, state or federal, would bring any clarity to this. It seems to be that the main push is legislatively. So we'll see what happens.
We'll definitely keep an eye on it, and I really do appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today about this issue. I had seen the article that you were quoted in, and you and I go back a few years, and so I really do take the time because I think it's really important, and that's why I'm doing this series, to have a balanced viewpoint on both sides and flesh out all of these issues, because I think sometimes and there was popular voter support for this, right? But I think it's also important to flesh out the issues, and hopefully it's not changed as a result of an incident, right? The hope is that if the legislature hears the concerns of law enforcement, that aspect can be changed, before there's an incident that brings this to the forefront in a bad way.
I agree with you, and there's so many other elements of the cannabis legislation, the underage consumption, and I know you're going to be talking with folks about that. But in that case, a perfect example, they passed that law that said you couldn't notify parents, and they changed it pretty quickly because of public outcry. So I imagine at some point they're going to have to respond to the public and understanding that there are some real concerns here, and hopefully it's not after a very serious incident. Let's just hope.
Chief, thank you very much. Stay safe, and when I'm down that way, I'll stop in and say hi.
Thanks, Meg.
All right, see ya. Bye-bye.
We hope you've enjoyed this series. Don't forget to subscribe, because before you know it, we'll be back with another great conversation. If you sell by referral, relationship building, and network marketing, pick a time and let's talk about podcasting. You might be surprised. When done correctly, all you have to do is have the conversations. If you're interested in starting a podcast, visit the contact page at njcriminalpodcast.com and send Meg a message. She'd love to discuss your legal podcast.